Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the NVTech hosted webinar on tips for completing the Program Year 17 HVRP Technical Performance Report, lovingly known as the TPR. I'm Cindy Borden. I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance here at the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, and we're one partner in the NVTech TA partnership. It's my pleasure today to have Brad Sickles, sorry about that. Maybe I'm thinking about lunch. To have Brad Sickles here with us today as our expert presenter to go through this presentation about how to complete the TPR. So with that, I am going to welcome Brad, and Brad, I'm going to hand control over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Cindy. I appreciate it. And how do I change the control over here? Okay, you did it already. Oops, wrong screen. Excuse me, I'm having a technical difficulty here. Thank you very much, Cindy. I'm pretty much hopeless with these machines nowadays, and I apologize for that. As Cindy said, my name is Brad Sickles. I work in the Office of National Programs for the Veterans Employment and Training Service for the U.S. Department of Labor. I got involved with HVRP about a few years ago, and been kind of splitting my time between working in HVRP-related matters as well as jobs for veteran state grants. What we're going to cover today is largely the TPR itself, but giving you a lot of background on the TPR in terms of the measures, the background in terms of how to calculate performance on the different indicators, how to interpret performance, and also we're going to get into looking at the data collection for follow-up, which is a little bit more complicated than it has been in the past, and we'll walk through that a good bit. And then finally, we'll walk through the TPR itself, showing some of the enhancements, some of the items that you probably come across when you're doing data entry, things like carryover participants and recording outcomes and things like that. So with that, I'm going to go into the agenda here. And first, we'll start off with, like I said, background on the critical indicators, get into how we're going to calculate outcomes on these performance indicators, talk a bit about documenting outcomes, which is getting a lot of attention at the national office level. We're actually in the process of devising a policy for data validation to ensure data quality in the future, and I'll keep you updated on that as it goes along. We'll get into completing the PY 2017 TPR, and then talk about collecting and reporting follow-up data, and hopefully we'll have about 30 to 40 minutes for questions at the end there. A little bit about the background. Some of the history here. VETS, the Funding Opportunity Announcement 17-01, which is the most recent solicitation for funding new grants in PY17. It actually detailed the critical performance measures in there, talked about how to collect follow-up and report follow-up, and made that a requirement. And then also has in there instructions on some data collection as well. That particular funding announcement applied the policy to just the new grantees in PY17. So we had some option year award grantees carried over from the previous year to the new year, and they're covered under Veterans Program Letter Number 3-17. And that VPL dealt with the option year award guidance. In that VPL, we required all the applicants who were applying for an option year award and received an option year award to actually use the 4 critical performance measures that are outlined in that funding announcement 17-01, as well as making the collection and reporting of follow-up data consistent with that FOA as well. VPL number 2-17 is actually what transmitted the reporting guidance. The technical performance report, the technical performance narrative, the stand down after action reports, those were all formally conveyed to the field in 2-17. 2-17 also has a tag in there, which is, I think you'll find very useful when you're completing the TPR. It goes into line-by-line instructions on completing the TPR. It has a glossary for all the definitions of terms that are used in the TPR. It has a nice table in there for detailing when you should be collecting follow-up data for based on when individuals exit the program. Yeah, it's just overall, I think you'll find that to be a very useful tool in terms of cleaning the TPR. Now, the 4 critical performance measures that apply to all grants, starting in PY17, all competitive grants, are the total number of enrollments, the overall placement rate, the overall average hourly wage of placement, and the placement rate for the chronically homeless. And we'll get into each of those indicators individually and kind of drill down in terms of how they're calculated. Now, we have the 4 indicators here. Now we get into how performance is actually interpreted on the individual indicators, as well as interpreting performance overall for the grant. On each individual indicator, each of the 4 indicators, performance is interpreted in terms of, is defined in terms of a range here. You got the grant performance goal here. In this example, we have 70%. Let's say it's the placement rate, overall placement rate. And that's the goal that was set in your TPR, overall for your, the planning form, excuse me, that was in your application form that was approved. That's where that information is coming from, and it's also actually populated into the TPR later on, and we'll get into that. You take 85% of that 70%, that target, and then you have what's called a lower bound or the floor for performance on the indicator. That blue shaded range there is basically a safety zone where you're neither meeting nor you're exceeding, you're neither failing nor exceeding performance on the indicator. So it's really kind of a safety zone built into there to allow you to take some risk if you wanted to in terms of serving special populations where performance might drop because of that, but you're still in the safety zone there. When you fall below that 85% of the that target there in terms of actual performance, you fall into the area of failure on an individual measure. Now, failure on any critical indicator, any of the 4 critical indicators during the course of the grant award may result in a corrective action plan requirement imposed by your grant office or technical representative. Failure on more than 50% of the critical indicators, and that would be failing on 3 of the 4 or more, 3 or more of the 4, may result in a high-risk designation, which really kind of elevates it, starts the process of designating you as a grantee that is at high risk of failing overall. In VETS, we view the performance, those critical indicators, as being deliverables, primary deliverables under your contract. So when you say you're going to deliver 100 enrollments, we're expecting 100 enrollments or more. When you fall below it, then you're not really giving us the number that you had said you were in terms of deliverables. And the same would be true for the other indicators where you have performance on there. So we're looking for performance outcomes that you had promised us in the application process, as well as when carried into the actual grant conditions. Now, successful performance on the grant overall is the meeting or performing above the minimum performance expectation on at least 2 or more of the critical performance indicators during the measurement period. So if you're meeting or exceeding 2 performance expectations on 2 of the 4 indicators, you would be considered to be meeting minimum expectations overall for your grant. And if you're failing on a grant, and you probably know this from your option year award guidance, you've gone through that, failing on a grant would actually kind of, in the second quarter, would disqualify you from applying for an option year award in the future. So performance is very important here. The success or failure overall at the end of the grant period of performance will now be taken into consideration when awarding future grants. Not only the option year awarded grants, but let's say you receive an option year award based on second quarter performance, and at the end of the year, your grant actually fails for some unknown reasons. It just performance tanks, so it failed. We gave you an option award for a grant that failed, and the grant officer now, and this will be published in some guidance soon, will now impose restrictions on the grant award, or the grant that was received that had actually failed. That option year award will have restrictions on it because of the past failure. And these restrictions are largely increased monitoring because there's the risk that you may fail again. So that's kind of what we're looking for. We want your performance to do better, and those conditions will be added to it to ensure successful performance. Critical performance indicators. A couple of key terms we'll go over before we get into the indicators themselves. The first is participant, and we also refer to this as an enrolled individual. A participant is an individual who is determined to be eligible to participate in the grant program and who receives a service funded by the program during the reporting period. So it's not only being determined eligible, they actually have to receive a service under it. It could be an assessment, an in-depth assessment, creating the IEP, case management, that kind of starts the process. Or it could be the delivery of some actual service itself before the IDP is actually created. It does exclude eligibility determination services and post-program follow-up tracking services only. So if it's like eligibility determination, doesn't count. And if you're in a period where it's post-program, that cannot continue the status of a participant. Exeter is, for our competitive grants, is a participant who is placed or who has discontinued services during a quarter and is not scheduled to receive future homeless veterans program services in the next 90 days or more. Those individuals be constituted as exiters. The exit date in this instance will be the grant closure date for that particular individual. The exit date will always be the last date of service funded by the grant. If the participant who, let's say, was exited from your grant and during that 90-day period afterwards experiences some difficulties and returns for other services, additional services from you as the provider, you can reopen the grant, that particular case, delete the quarter of exit and delete the early recorded placement hourly wage information and sort of reopen the case and continue services that way. A gap in service can stop the 90-day clock at any point in time, and that could be things like someone has to step out, they're in the hospital for a month or so and they're coming back. Whatever the circumstance may be, it can cause a delay there, and that's permitted to actually stop that 90-day clock in that instance. When you're stopping that 90-day clock, you need to really account for that gap by describing why you actually imposed into this gap in there to prevent them from being exited from the program. And that's typically documented in your case notes. This is an illustration of participation and exit. You have on the far left here, they receive service, or eligible, determined eligible, and actually receive services funded under the grant. That would be the enrollment date, or the date of participation. Then you've got this blue period of participation, and then you have the last date of service under that, or the case closure date. That would be the exit date in this case. And then you have the 90-day period there. If they receive services, additional services in that 90-day period, you would reopen the case and continue services to them. We'll get into defining the critical performance indicators now. The first one is total number of enrollments, and this has been a long-standing indicator that we've had in the HVRP program. It's defined as the cumulative number of program participants during a reporting period. Carryover participants from a prior grant award are actually included in the total in addition to the new enrollments, so they'll appear in there. And there is a separate breakout for them on the TPR that shows carryovers versus total enrollment, so you get an idea of how many new enrollments you had. Carryover participants always show in the first quarter. So when they're carried over from one grant to the next, when you enroll them in the first quarter of the subsequent grant as a carryover. If when they're leaving the other program, you just leave the exit date open. There's no exit quarter on them for the prior grant. So that would indicate you're actually going to carry them over to the future grant award. The placement rate is calculated by dividing the total number of participants employed in one or more jobs by the total number of exiters during the same period of reporting. And we got period here twice. This is, as you know, last year we kind of changed that definition. It used to be placement was divided by placements divided by enrollments. Now it's placements divided by exiters. And because of that change in definition, performance in PY16 actually was about 8 to 10% higher than it was in the previous year. Well, somewhere in that area for most grants. I think overall it's maybe about a 5% difference for us. So it's because you're allowed to carry over individuals, not exiting them, so you can actually have a higher actual placement rate because of that, which we think is more fair to you, and also it's better for the participant in the long run. Each employee participant must be exited in order to get credit on the indicator. And I can't emphasize this enough. If you have the quarter of placement, should always match a quarter of exit for individuals. The overall hourly wage at placement for employment, it's actually the average or mean hourly wage at placement for those participants reported as employed during the reporting period. So we're looking at the hourly wage they're getting paid. It's calculated by dividing the sum of the total hourly wages at placement for all employed participants by the total number of reported as employed during the same period. In instances where a participant is placed to employment multiple times, the grantee has the discretion about choosing which hourly wage to represent the job with in this particular case for those calculations. The placement rate for the chronically homeless is actually a subgroup of the placement rate for participants overall. And it only applies to those who meet the criteria for chronically homeless. A chronically homeless person is one who is homeless continuously for at least 12 months, or at least 4 separate occasions in the last 3 years, with combined occasions, total length of time of at least 12 months. That's really the official definition that was adopted by Housing and Urban Development, and the one that we use here at VETS as well. The outcome is calculated by dividing the total number of chronically homeless participants that are employed in one or more jobs by the total number of chronically homeless exiters during the same period. Each employed participant must also be exited in order to obtain credit for this indicator. Performance on the chronically homeless indicator generally runs about 8 to 10% lower than the placement rate overall because it's a much more difficult population to serve. And I'm sure you probably experienced that as well and take that into consideration when you're proposing goals. Talk a bit about documenting outcomes here, which I think is very important, something that's getting a lot of attention at the national office, because there's a requirement in the Government Performance Results Act that the information that we report to Congress in performance plans and results there, they have to be valid, reliable, and validated. So we haven't been validating outcomes as we should be with HVRP, and we're now in the process of looking at different ways to create a policy in that regard and how to implement that policy. So you'll hear more about that probably over the next 4 to 5 months in terms of how progress on that one. When you're documenting outcomes, and this is actually included in the tag as a requirement, these are the approved documents that you can use for demonstrating or showing evidence that they were actually employed on a job. You can use printouts from from the employer's data system. You can have contacts with the employers, and if you do that, you have to document who you contacted at the employer, the date of the contact information, as well as the number of hours worked in the last week, and the hourly wage. You can also use employer statement of earnings. You can use family or business financial records if they're self-employed, quarterly estimated tax for self-employed persons, unemployment insurance wage record statement. That one typically has a lag with it, so that may not be something to use right now. Pay stubs, which is also a very good source that you can get directly from the participants who are employed. They can provide you with that information. Now, all data sources and methods used have to be documented in your participant file, and they are subject to an audit. Now, self-attestation, this is where the participant actually says, I'm employed, this is where I was at, this is the amount of money or the hours I work, the hourly wage I make. They can provide that information on a self-attestation in the event where obtaining the above documents are just so burdensome on the participant or on your program overall that it's just really not financially worth it to actually pursue it. And an example of this would be, let's say you're looking for employer records and say you're in that hurricane area that was, let's say you're in Puerto Rico. That's a really kind of devastated area. That you had, the records may have been disappeared. The employer may be totally wiped out. There's no, your records in your building are wiped out. So there may be nothing to use in terms of documenting employment in that regard. And that would be an instance where you could use self-attestation. Next, we'll get into reporting outcomes in the TPR itself and walk through that. Now, when you look at the TPR, you'll notice the PY17 TPR on each of the screens, the tabs in the TPR workbook, have a starburst icon on it. It says PY17 version 1. That will clearly indicate to you that you're using the correct form for PY17. Now, when you're collecting reporting follow-up data for PY16, you're reporting that on the old PY16 form that was started before, that you're reporting all along the PY16. You just continue on with quarters 5 through 8 until that information is totally collected. You also see an icon on there where it says TPR tag. And it actually provides an on-link to the technical assistance guide. So if your system is currently linked online, and you can click on that tag and go to the instructions there if you have some sort of questions you need to research. You notice on the TPR that we have a stoplight indicator, and in some cases, many cases, that stoplight indicator has been interpreted incorrectly. Partly my fault in not conveying it properly, I think. The stoplight indicator was designed just to indicate to you as the grantee whether or not you are required to submit a corrective action plan in your technical performance narrative that you submit with the TPR. That was the sole purpose there. The stoplight indicators, for example, will always go green and yellow. They only show up as red where corrective action plan is required in certain quarters. So in quarters 1 through 3, it can show as red for enrollment. In quarters 2 and 3, it can only show as red for the other indicators, the placement rates as well as the average hourly wage. To kind of correct that, I've added into the TPR, and it's actually on. This is actually the version that's uploaded right now on VET's website. It has a nice indicator, and it only appears when you hit the 4th quarter of your grant award, and it will pop up and give you an overall assessment for your grant in terms of how you did. So again, this only shows when you hit the 4th quarter, and in this example, they met all 4 of the critical indicators, minimum expectations. Something else about the TPR is we have an enhanced demographics tab, which gives you more detailed information on subpopulation groups to give you an idea about, some groups are going to make less money than others because of the barriers they have to employment. And you can actually see this in a visual fashion, which may help you in the future if you're planning to target a specific group. Like you said, if you wanted to target nothing but chronically homeless, you can see how the chronically homeless do in your program and come up with a goal for that. Same thing if you wanted to focus strictly on IVTP, it will give you that information as well. The PY17 TPR and related forms can be downloaded from that link that's on the screen here. Some additional items to note about the TPR, and I would say that the majority of grantees have no problems getting the file name specified correctly, but there are still some that don't get it right for whatever reason. And I just cover the TPR, the first line here on the naming convention here. It starts out with HV, which is an indicator of the program, being homeless veterans. Then it's followed by the 5-digit number for your grant award, followed by an I, a 1, or a 2, which would indicate whether it's an initial award, if it's in its first option year award, or second option year. Then it's followed by the program year, then followed by the quarter for reporting quarter, and then followed by the designation of the type of form. In this case, it's the TPR. Now, the TPR has an XLSB extension on it. I want to bring that to your attention. If normally it would be saved, it has macros built into it, which make it a huge workbook. If it was saved as strictly as a macro enabled, it would be about 17 megabytes. With a binary, it actually is a streamlined way of more efficient way of storing code and processing it, and would reduces that file size to about 7 megabytes. So it's an XLSB to make the worksheet easier to work with, a little bit more manageable in terms of size. Now, you submit the TPR and its accompanying TPN to the grant officer technical representative by way of email, and they will process it for you. The TPR is due no later than the last business day of the month after the end of the quarterly reporting period. In some cases, the GOTR may ask you to actually submit that report to you, let's say a week or two beforehand, so they can work with you in terms of working on any bugs to make sure you're getting the form reported and submitted correctly. Next, we'll get into the TPR demonstration itself, and this is just a screenshot of the TPR summary page. I call it a summary page because unlike the majority of the screens, it is not largely data entry. There's a few data entry items on here, and the rest is calculated from worksheets that you populate with participant data here. All right, Cindy, I need your help again. I got paused for some reason.
Do you want to go to actual live? There you go.
No, I want to go to the Excel. Sorry. Thank you, Cindy. This is why they don't let me out of the office very often. This is like the second time I really screwed up with this thing. I apologize for that. This is the actual Excel workbook itself, and it's populated with some data I obtained from a PY16 grantee, putting it in the PY17 form itself. You see up in the upper left-hand corner where we have the starburst, PY17, version 1. The TPR tag icon on it, if you wanted to link to that. When you're entering information into the workbook itself, you always want to start with the 700 plan goal tab over here on the far left. The plan goals tab is where you're going to enter in the plan goals that are part of your grant award, that actual form you submitted during your application that was approved. So you're just transferring the data from that form onto this form verbatim. And it only has to be entered on this form one time only for the entire grant period, unless, of course, you were granted some sort of change to your performance numbers due to some truly extenuating circumstances. So here you enter the applicant name, the name of the project, the period of performance, the actual funding amount, and you'll see when you go over these, there's a comment box with each one giving you a definition of the term. You're not required to import the information from your plan goals chart in terms of the populations, but you're welcome to do so if you want to. Then you get into entering your actual quarterly targets for a number of different data elements here. So plan performance, you got the number of eligibility assessments that you're planning, the number of participants you plan to enroll out of those assessed, placement in transitional and permanent housing, those who are referred to VA for benefits, you're recording those numbers, place to employment, which you're planning there, average hourly wage at placement, which you're planning, the placement rate overall, and again, it's based on the number of exiters when we're looking at it, so it'll be higher than what you've had in the past. The placement rate for chronically homeless, cost per placement, number of exiters, and then we get into the follow-up outcomes a little bit later on in that top part. The middle section deals with planned training activities that you enter for the quarter, that you're planning for the quarter, each of the quarters here, and anything that's shaded in gray is automatically computed for you, so you don't have to enter that. It's based on information that's already keyed in for you, that you've already keyed in, excuse me. Then you get into plan supportive services. I want to highlight that the life skills and money management is no longer a training service. It is now considered a supportive services or a pre-vocational service. It's not to be treated as a training service when counting percent in training. Then you have your planned expenditures that you're estimating for each of the 4 quarters. Over to the far right here, I just want to point out there are a couple items that you need to key in the information for. One is the overall the placement rate for chronically homeless. You need to kind of key in what you're planning for that. And then the other one is the median earnings. Median earnings is, I can't calculate it from these equations, so it's something that you're going to have to provide for us in terms of the planning form itself. And we'll get into the definitions of the terms of these follow-up indicators in a few minutes here. So you have that. So you enter in your planned values. That's the first step. The second step, this is just me. This is what I would do. Yeah, filling out a quarterly report. The name of your grant is going to automatically populate. The grant number you have to enter. You're going to enter in the state for your grant is operating in. Whether it's an initial award, first or second year option year award. You specify the quarter in here, which has a drop-down box. In this case, it's the 4th quarter. The initial PY for the grant that was an item that you had to enter or select from in PY 2016 is now static. That was because we had different performance indicators, and it created kind of a complex way of trying to compute performance and demonstrating that on the forms itself. So now everybody's on the same measure, so that particular data element is now static. You don't have to do anything with it. Then you enter in your current grant award information here as well. The other data entry items on here are the number of eligibility assessments. You would enter that for each quarter, as well as the planned expenditures for each quarter. So you would enter that, not planned expenditures, actual expenditures. So you're entering in the actual eligibility assessments, as well as the actual expenditures on a quarterly basis for each quarter. Okay. In the gray shaded areas, that information is automatically populated from data from other worksheets that are included as part of the workbook itself. Now you'll see here you've got your indicators. There's a yellow stoplight here. We have a green, 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 yellow. So this grant is doing fairly well overall. You see one number over here, the 14, has a strike through on it, and that's because there was some data error or data inconsistencies on the participant information tab that we'll go into a few minutes here. So you've entered the data on the plan target chart. You've entered the expected values here for assessments, as well as not expected, the actual number of assessments, as well as actual expenditures here for the quarter that you're reporting. The next tab I would go to, recommend going to, is actually the participant information tab. And this is where most of your performance data is coming from that is reported on that TPR summary form that we just left, the 701 Technical Performance Report. When you're entering information, remember the participant ID should not be an SSN, but it should be a unique number to that particular individual and their enrollment period. It is possible for an individual, let's say, to be enrolled twice, or maybe more than twice, in a particular program year as they exit, and you decide you want to work with them still, and you re-enroll them. If they're re-enrolled, you need to have a different participant ID number here, but the participant name would stay the same. Just to indicate to us that it's actually not the same individual as before, is that a different employment or enrollment transaction that we're tracking here in the outcomes on. There's always a risk in terms of re-enrolling somebody who was a negative before. That's just a decision that you as a grantee would have to make in terms of whether or not it's in the interest of the participant if they can benefit from additional services, as well as if the grant wants to take a risk in terms of re-enrolling them. So you can enter that information. Then you go into the quarter enrolled, and you enter that. And these are all drop-down boxes on most of these. Just a few that have where you're entering in actual values. So you enter the quarter that they're enrolled, indicate whether or not they are a carryover participant, and again, that's a yes or a no. If they're a carryover participant from the previous award, let's say from the PY16 grant, you always want to indicate them as being enrolled in the first quarter. And here's where you indicate yes. The quarter of enrollment would always be one here as well to match the quarter enrolled for co-enrollment in the AJC, if they were co-enrolled in the AJC in the prior program year. If they were co-enrolled, let's say, not in the prior program, but this year, you would actually enter the actual number itself. So they weren't enrolled the previous year, but they are now. Then you, let's say, in the second quarter, and you refer them to the AJC, that's where you would record it. The quarter placed and the quarter of exit, as I said, should always match. And then you have the hourly wage that you're reporting here. That is one that you have to key in. The others are actually looking at the drop-down list. Here you're entering a value, and it does have a validation edit in there to prevent extremely low values like 25 cents an hour. That will flag for you as being something that's suspicious. Then you have the characteristics of the individuals at intake that you're entering for individuals. For those who are carryover participants, these are the same, it's identical responses that were in the PY16 TPR that you reported. Now, when you get to the miscellaneous services, for those who are carryover participants, as well as the training activities and other services here, you're going to enter in the quarter they actually received that service in the current grant year period of performance. The information from the previous grant does not carry over for services and training transactions to the new award. So we're looking for new services that you're providing in addition to what you provided in the previous grant year. Each of these has, like we have for the others, it has the definitions of terms up there to make it easy for you to look at, as well as the link to the technical assistance guide over here if you need to go further into definitions and instructions on data entry line by line here. So we'll give you that information here. Okay. You may recall from the earlier summary page on the technical performance report itself, we had two errors. And when we go to the data here, you can see the individual data itself. You can see where the errors are occurring. You might recall on the TPR, we're showing 14 placed in employment, whereas we only show 12 being exited. And when you go to the form itself, you'll actually see the errors highlighted for you to correct. So in this case, it should be 4. or it's 3, then it should be 3, right? Okay, sorry, I did that wrong. There we go. Sorry about that. I had too much coffee at lunch, so I apologize for that. So here's how you would correct it. And then you go back over here, and you can see the error is no longer there. So there's your participant information tab. Now, when you're collecting information on characteristics of individuals themselves, if they refuse to report their gender to you, that can be left blank or missing data. They can refuse any of the participant information items, characteristics items, that are not used for eligibility determination. If it's used for eligibility determination, then they're required to report it because you have to document that. But if they came to you and you asked what their gender was, and they refused to give it to you, then you would leave that blank. Same with ethnicity and race as well, the different racial categories. You see, we collect race on an individual basis. Race and ethnicity are now separate items itself. You have ethnicity where it's Hispanic or non-Hispanic, and then you get into the individual racial categories. And these are groups that are created by OMB, and this is actually following their reporting requirements for reporting racial characteristics and ethnicity. So in race, they can actually be recorded in more than one category. So you see for right here in this particular record, there are African American as well as white. So one parent was black and the other parent was white in this instance. And then it would automatically calculate over here for you whether it's a multiracial individual or not. And we'll see how that reports out on the demographics tab in a minute here. We have age, military service, economic disadvantage, and these all have the definitions of terms in here at the very top. Welfare recipient, homeless. Homeless is a category that tends to be underreported, unfortunately. Our program can only serve homeless individuals. So if you're not reporting somebody as homeless, I mean, that's a question to us as to why you're not doing that. And it could be you're saying they're not homeless because I'm not sure what reasons, but if you're flagging this being not homeless, for example, I think there might be one in here. There we go. There's a no right there. Be prepared to explain why you're reporting that, and it's very likely a data entry on your area report. Because you say they're not homeless, and you're automatically telling us that they're not eligible for your program. And that could be a grave concern to you. Homeless with family has, okay, homeless is an eligibility item. Homeless with family is an eligibility item. Incarcerated or recently incarcerated is an eligibility item. So these are the ones that have to be yes or no, and you have to have documentation to support it with a yes. Then you get into chronically homeless, which has to be documented. And I believe that's it in terms of, oh, there's veteran status I have to put in here too, the type of veteran they are, like last military service and things like that. So the veteran categories have to be in there as well. But the others, I mean, if they refuse to tell you, you're not required to probe any further and get that information. Unless, of course, that information element is used for eligibility determination services itself. And here's where you're entering in the different training categories you're receiving, and has the definitions of terms here. You're just entering the quarter they first received that service. And I think that's, we do supportive services as well. So that's pretty well straightforward. I mean, it's only got a few where there's actual data entry outside of the drop-down responses, which should make it very easy in terms of selecting response categories and tracking information. Now, the TP, or the tag for the competitive grants reporting, that instruction guide for the technical performance report, has as an attachment in there a data entry form, or kind of a maybe a summary form that you can attach to a participant file that mirrors the data elements that you're collecting to report in this particular tab itself, as well as the post-exit tab. So you can have information that you report the quarter that they were enrolled, things like that. So it's kind of like a running total for you. You want to make sure that any information that you have in there, especially related to the outcomes and eligibility, is fully documented in your case file. And that's the participant information tab. The Exeter tab, and this happens when you're going into following or collecting follow-up data on individuals who have left your program. The TPR itself requires capturing up to 4 quarters of follow-up data on every Exeter from a grant. So it means you'll be doing follow-up during this period of performance for this particular grant, as well as maybe following up on individuals from your prior award for the quarters 5 through 8. So you might do quarters 1 through 4 here on the new award, and also reporting 5 through 8 for the prior award on that older TPR. So in any given quarter, you could be submitting two TPRs to your grant office or technical representative. Now, when you specify the exit quarter, the information is pre-populated here. You can automatically pull in the participant ID and the participant name for following up on individuals. You can remove the blank rows in here by just clicking up the upper right-hand corner here, that remove button, so you can see clearly for data entry how you want to do this. I suggest every time you go in here for doing data entry, refresh the list so you make sure that anybody got added or actually being followed up on here with your data collection. And then refresh the list and then remove the blank rows. So here's where you enter the information. Again, a 1 means yes, a 0 means no. You enter in the actual hours if they say that they're employed and the hourly wage, and it automatically calculates the second quarter earnings. The earnings are computed by taking the hourly wage times the number of hours per week times 13 to derive the quarterly earnings. So it's kind of like a best case scenario. This is what they're doing, typically. Typically, there's periods of unemployment, or maybe wages go down or hours go down. There's some sort of fluctuation, but this is how we're calculating the outcomes for you at this point in time. And then you've got the different quarters you're following up on. This would be the second quarter, the third quarter, the fourth quarter. That'd be the 4 quarters that you're following up on. And then you've got the 5th quarter. So those exiting in that first quarter, you're following up individuals through the 5th quarter for them. And there's no information for this quarter because this one will reach the 4th quarter. So it gives you an idea of how that works in terms of how it's calculated and things like that. The number up the upper left-hand corner, 10, is actually the number of individuals that are showing up on the screen here. So you can see you're following up on 10 individuals. The same is true for the other follow-up quarters. Just check the sheet. If they're populated on there, have been exited, then you want to make sure that you're collecting follow-up data on them. And this is the second one. And you can see here we've got 11. Again, the same information. The exit in the second quarter, this will be the earnings they had in the third quarter, or what they call the first quarter after exit, and so on. We're reporting the whether or not they were employed, the hours they worked, as well as the wage. Now, the information on the hours worked and the actual average hourly wage are things you want to have documented in the file, some sort of evidence from the employer, a pay stub, something in there that shows that the individual actually validates the information that you provided here, that it's actually correct. And the same is true for the other follow-up tabs. In this case, we have one for the third quarter, and it shouldn't be anybody in the fourth quarter right now, I don't believe, having information that's collected because they're not eligible yet. So those are the data entry tabs themselves. The information that you do on the data entry, you want to make sure it's up to date and current when you submit your TPR. Then it will come back in and will populate the TPR itself with the outcomes here, and you'll see them displayed here for you. A stoplight over here is doing a plan versus actual for your grant, and it's actually cumulative performance for the quarter for the fourth quarter in this case. It's the cumulative performance for the entire year because of reporting this for 4 quarters in this case. If it were 5 quarters, then it would cover a 5-quarter period, things like that. But you specify the quarter covered by it, and it does a comparison to the plan goals and looking at plan performance for those 4 quarters, and will demonstrate deviation from the plan goal. A yellow means it's less than the target. As I mentioned before, it does not go yellow in this case, or red in this case, in the 4th quarter for enrollments, but it will for the other 3 indicators. I said that wrong. Let me back up for a second. The stoplight, it can go green or yellow for all of the indicators in any quarter. It can only show up as red for enrollments in quarters 1 through 3. It can only show up as red for the average hourly wage of placement, the placement rate, and the chronic replacement rate in quarters 2 and 3 at this point in time. So you could be failing, for example, in quarter 4, and it would not show here as you requiring a corrective action plan because it's reached the end of your grant, and I'm not sure you can make any changes to improve performance at that point in time. So that was the reasoning for it, and that rule is currently under consideration as we're kind of moving forward with revisions for the next iteration of the TPR. So there are the outcomes. You can see they're automatically computed for you. The very far right here will give you the running totals, the overall outcomes here. And you can see, in this particular case, the rate for the enrolled, if you did the placement rate under the old methodology, will be 73%, whereas by carrying people forward and basing it on exiters, performance is actually higher at 76%. So you might have quite a difference between those two in terms of how many individuals you'd carry over from one grant to the next. So your outcomes are in the far right, populated there. There's this centerpiece here we talked about. Since we're in the 4th quarter here, it's giving you an indication of the overall performance. You reach the 4th quarter, you chose 4th quarter up here, and it allows it to actually display this. In any other quarter, it will show up as being black and won't have any outcomes there. But once you specify the 4th quarter, it's going to tell you what your overall performance is on the critical indicators. Let me jump back to the slides themselves. Reporting follow-up results. Here's where it gets kind of a little complicated and is a challenge sometimes to try to understand what's going on here. 4 quarters of post-exit follow-up employment and earnings outcomes are collected and reported for every participant exiting services. A little bit technical, just getting the slides up here. Here we go. When you're reporting follow-up results, you're reporting 4 quarters of post-exit follow-up results for every participant. You might recall when we had WIA measures, or those post-program measures in PY16 and earlier, when I say it's the Workforce Investment Act, we were kind of aligning with that program in terms of post-program measures. They were based, looked at employment in the 1st quarter after exit. They looked at retention, whether or not those individuals who were enrolled or employed in the 1st quarter after exit were actually also had earnings showing in the 2nd and 3rd quarters after exit or being retained. And then you had the earnings in the 2nd and 3rd quarter after exit that were being reported. For this, unlike the retention under the old measures, we only follow up individuals who were actually employed in that 1st quarter. That's no longer true with this. When you're doing follow-up now, it's looking at everybody. So if you enroll 100 individuals, you're tracking 100 individuals, the follow-up for each of those individuals. So it's not just tracking those who were retained, so to speak. Let's see. Follow-up, as I mentioned before, is required for your current grant award, And if you had a prior grant award, the terms and conditions of your current grant award require you to collect and report that prior outcome data for that prior award and report it in the TPR on a quarterly basis until you reach the end of that prior award's reporting, eighth quarter reporting. The only exception for, and it only applies to PY17, is for PY16 grantees, new grantees, who did not have follow-up actually associated with their grant awards themselves. Beginning in PY18, they will have those conditions attached. So for PY17, they weren't required to collect it, but could opt to if they wanted to. And if they did opt to collect it, and they accepted the additional 3% increase in funds to do that reporting, then they're required to report on PY16 as well as the PY17 follow-up outcomes. For PY16, it'd be reporting for quarters 1 through 4, PY17 for quarters 5 through 8. Let me back up here. For PY16, be recording PY17 be recording for quarters 1 through 4, and in PY16 quarters 5 through 8. I get that backwards. I get tongue-tied. The TPR and its accompanying technical performance narrative for a specific grant must be submitted for each of the 4 participation quarters in the grant period of performance, and for each of the follow-up tracking quarters covered by a subsequent award or an option year award. So that's the requirement in your grant award. Grantees receiving subsequent awards are required to submit separate TPRs and TPNs for those separate program years. So you have one for 16 and 17, or you might have one for 17 and 18. Reporting follow-up results, and I'm going to highlight this because there's been some sort of confusion in terms of the definitions of the measures, and these measures are becoming of greater importance as we've been dealing with our oversight agencies, the Office of Management and Budget. They've been strongly encouraging us to adopt these post-program measures as critical measures as well. Still working out how to apply that to grants and managing those grants, but again, we told the OMB would be looking into it and moving forward as best we could on that. So they want us to move forward with adopting these as critical indicators sometime in the future. So they carry on some significant to you now. So not only are we looking at the 4 core or critical indicators, but adding these 3 additional ones on at some point later here. Employment rate in the second quarter after exit. Remember, it was the employment rate in the first quarter under the previous grant awards. But this one is now the second quarter after exit. The percentage of program participants who are in unsubsidized employment during the second quarter after the exit from the program. Computed as the number of participants who exit during the reporting period who are found to be employed in the second quarter after exit divided by the number of participants who exited during the reporting period. So it's pretty straightforward here. It can be any job during those 2 in that quarter. If they're employed just 1 week, they count as employed, and you count their earnings there. You count the employment, excuse me. The median earnings is looking at the second quarter after exit as well. So if they're employed in that second quarter, here's where you report their earnings. Not average earnings, but median earnings. And the median earnings is a measure of central tendency. It's not necessarily equal to average. Sometimes the average can be skewed by extreme numbers, either high or low. The median in this case would be the actual center value. If you line up all the responses for average earnings from highest to lowest, the median would be the value that's dead center in that list. And again, it's only based on those who are employed in the second quarter after exit. Similar to the second quarter after exit, the employment rate there's also an indicator for the fourth quarter employment rate. And again, this is everybody. It's not just those who were employed in the first or second quarter. It's including everybody that left your program, and you're actually computing the employment rate again 4 quarters later. And like the second quarter, it's a percentage of program participants who are in unsubsidized employment during the fourth quarter after exit from the program. The rate is computed by the number of participants who exit during the reporting period who are found in employment in the fourth quarter and divided by the total number of participants in that reporting period. 2 TPRs and 2 2PNs are to be submitted each quarter for grantees receiving subsequent awards. We talked about that before. This graphic is to kind of help you envision the follow-up data collection. You might have to squint because the type is a little bit small on here. Here we have the program years. You'll see that right here it says this is PY16, this would be PY17, and this one over here would be PY18. Oops. So there's the program years. Here are the exiters during that period of performance, and these are the outcomes being reported during that particular grant period, or for that particular program year. So for your TPR, PY17 TPR, you're reporting follow-up outcomes in the second quarter for half of the individuals in your program, roughly half. The other half are being followed up on in the subsequent award, where that information is being reported. The 4 quarters of follow-up for the PY16 are all collected during the PY17 grant and then reported for PY16. Now, if you don't receive a subsequent grant award, there is no requirement to collect follow-up data because there's no binding agreement between us and the grantee. So in this case, you can see what data is being collected under which program year, and the report's been resulted in what TPR. So even though the data here is being collected in the PY17, it's still being reported in that PY16 TPR until all follow-up outcomes are being attained. And the same is true when you're looking at other years as well. So this has got a graphic just to give you an indication of when performance outcomes are to be reported, in what TPR, and then what grant is actually paying for that follow-up information. The tag itself for the TPR has a nice little graphic in there showing when you need to follow up on individuals when they're exiting for each quarter. So it's just a nice little graphic to show you when you need to collect the follow-up data in what quarter for what individuals. And with that, I have a few policy updates I'll provide to you. Just want to make you aware, and you're probably already aware of this, that the stand-down solicitation was amended, and the amendment was published on September 15th. It actually replaces the current caps for 7,000 and 10,000 with a cap of 50,000 for stand-down events for those events that are serving veterans from disaster-declared areas like those in Texas, in Florida, and Puerto Rico. The VPL on revising, the current solicitation is also extended 90 days, so that solicitation is active through the end of December, and there'll be a new one published after that. The VPL on revising grant performance goals for programs located in disaster and similarly impacted areas was drafted and is currently going through its first round of review with VETS clearance. Once it gets through VETS clearance, which will probably be very likely in the next week or so, then it will go into Department of Clearance and hopefully being published in the next month or so. That's what we're looking at. In this particular guidance letter, it's actually teasing out information that was contained in the option year award process, where it talked about special conditions or special consideration when your performance is low, unreasonably low, due to circumstances or events that are totally outside the control of the program management. And that we're teasing out the that special consideration and now making that a sort of a separate VPL where you can apply for changes to your grant performance expectations if you should be faced with extenuating circumstances that are totally outside your control, and it outlines those circumstances in there for you. So when you're applying for an option year award, you want to make sure that if you are experiencing any of those conditions that are outside your control and it's hurting your performance, make sure you apply for to have those goals lowered prior to going to the option year award process. Otherwise, you would not qualify if your performance is low because of extenuating circumstances. So I just want to bring that to your attention there. And there's also going to be a revision drafted for 317 that kind of teases out that special consideration, because now it's going to be on a separate VPL. And that's primarily it. It makes it more streamlined doing option year awards in terms of determining that. Next, I'm open to questions. I need to get a drink of water here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brad. I'll give you a second to take a breath and get a drink of water. We do have quite a few questions, and folks, please feel free to keep sending those in. The questions, I'm going to go back, Brad, to sort of the beginning of how we received the questions, so it may be going back to kind of the beginning of the presentation, just so you know that. The first question came up around section 4, the budget part of the template. And the question is saying that the green, yellow, red indicators seem to be wrong, at least in this person's experience. If they are underspending, it is showing up as red, and if they are overspending, it is showing up as green. Is that actually incorrect? Is that something that will be fixed, or is that just perhaps a data
it's actually
error?
fixed. Yeah, they're using an older version of the PY16 TPR, and that's why it's showing that way currently. It does not show that way on the PY17.
Okay, so that's a recommendation to make sure folks look at that little blue starburst at the top, and that if they're doing PY16 information, it will be on the PY16 report, and on PY17 they need to be using that updated version.
Well, for PY16, yeah, they need to get the updated version from their goder.
Okay, great, thank you, Brad. Let's see, the next question is around exiters. And I think you answered this, but it came up in a couple different places, so we're going to ask it again. So exiters, once a participant is exited and then they return again, are they counted as a new enrollment?
If they return within that 90-day period, it's not a new enrollment. If they return after that 90-day period, then they are a new enrollment.
Okay, great, thank you. And just some clarification that the quarter of placement should be the quarter of exit, so that if someone is placed, they should be exited that same quarter?
Correct. Employment's the desired outcome here, the end result. So yes, if you're placed, then the record should be closed. Great,
thank you. We had a couple of questions around the some clarification for the definition of chronic homelessness. The HUD's definition of chronic homelessness requires a disability, a disabling condition be part of that definition. And the DOL versions that are available do not have that disabling condition requirement. They just have the time frame requirements. Is that assumed to be part of the definition of chronic homeless, or does DOL have a different definition than HUD on that?
I'll have to look into that, because it's been a while since I looked at the definitions, but I'll get back to you on that one after researching it. Okay,
great, thank you. Let's see, so here's a question about this, folks who had both PY16 grants and PY17 grants as well. So the question is, do we need to continue using the TPR that was received back in February and March in 2016 for all the follow-up tracking for the PY16 grants, and then use the PY17 form for folks who are enrolled for Q1, which they're working on right now, those first quarter reports?
That is correct.
Great. So folks will be doing, who had grants last year and are doing tracking this year, would be submitting 2 separate worksheets, one with the PY16 data and one with PY17 data.
Right. PY17 will be in the first quarter, and for PY16, you will be submitting 5th quarter results.
Okay, great. So here's another question about folks who might be re-enrolled, who might have been placed and then re-enrolled after that 90-day period. And the question is, if they are re-enrolled and then require a new ID and then are replaced, would that mean that a grantee is able to count that placement, to count that more than one placement for that veteran?
Yes.
Okay. I like those short answers, Brad. Thanks. Let's see what we've got here. We have another question around what constitutes a placement, sort of definitional idea about what is a placement. Does part-time employment count, temporary employment, those kinds of things?
Yes, if they've earned a wage, any wage, and it can be in covered or uncovered employment, and you can document they earned a wage, then yeah, they're placed.
Okay. All right, thank you. We have another question around getting back to the definition of training and what constitutes training, that 80% requirement. Specifically, is there a list of what does and doesn't fit under that requirement? And then sort of the part B of that question is, when did life skills and money management move out of training and why did that happen? So sort of part one is there a list of those, of what constitutes training? And part two is why life skills and money management are no longer part of that list.
Yeah, we have a definition for training. We're looking at one point in time making a list, but it would be too exhaustive, and I'm not sure we could cover everything. So we just have the broad definition of training in there, where you're actually being trained in learning an occupational skill for employment. Excuse me.
Okay, so that was part one. So there's not a specific list, but there is a definition, and that is in the tag, Brad?
It is.
Okay, great. And then the second part of this question was why the change in the past, life skills and money management counted as part of that training and why that has changed.
Yeah, life skills and money management is really not occupational skills training. I mean, it's not focused on a vocation. It's focusing on more something to do with personal living, things like that, which will be useful to the individual, but not necessarily useful for getting a job.
Okay, great, thank you. We have another question about the subclassification of Hispanic as a race. I believe that the Hispanic, Latino, or non-Latino is a separate question from race. Is that correct?
That is correct. It's labeled as ethnicity now.
And that's to conform with WIOA and other federal standards as well. Is that right, Brad?
Well, it's to comply with OMB's reporting requirements. We had not followed them for some time, apparently.
So the first question is an ethnicity question, either Latino or Hispanic, Latino, yes or no, and then the second question is a race question, which would include Caucasian, African American, Asian, et cetera, et cetera.
That's correct. And they can be in multiple racial categories. Great,
thank you. And just to clarify on the plan goals chart, there was some confusion that some of the line items there were grayed out, and so a grantee couldn't enter them in even though they were supposed to be plan goals. Is that due to those being calculations or things that are based on the other parts of that plan goals chart?
I'm not familiar with what the problem with that one would be. Are they using the correct forms?
We will follow up and see.
I haven't heard this one before.
Okay, great.
Unless it was, they may be referring to the application process where there were some difficulties with that form during the application, for the FOA, but not as part of the TPR itself. It should not be a problem.
Okay, great. There are a couple of folks who had questions about that homeless category that you mentioned when you showed the one example of somebody having a no marked as being homeless. And there were questions around the folks who fall into the imminent risk category of homelessness. That does meet the definition of homeless for HVRP eligibility. And how would that be recorded in the TPR? Would that be just a yes under homelessness, or since there's no separate category for imminent risk?
Yeah, the imminent risk is part of the homeless definition. So, I mean, and we're using a homeless definition for designating whether they're homeless or not. So it should be designating as yes if it's an imminent risk.
Okay, great. I think there was some confusion about that. So if it's a person at imminent risk, they would mark yes under homeless.
Correct. We're looking at
that definition.
Yeah, we're looking at the actual compliance with the definition, not whether or not they're. I mean, they could actually be housed but still be eligible.
Right, if they were in emergency shelter or something like that. That's
right. You know, you're being evicted, whatever it might be, things like that could happen.
Let's see, there's another question just about chronic homelessness and how that might be documented in the case file, that the veteran meets the definition of chronically homeless versus the homeless definition in general.
Yeah, that one you're going to largely take from the participant itself. I mean, you're going to get the information from them during the interview and getting a signed attestation from them.
Okay, great. Let's see. So this is a question more about guidance and what guidance exists. So other than the tag, VPLs 317 and 217, are there any other guidance documents that applied in the past? There were special provisions, you know, things like that.
Definitely I'm aware of. I mean, you know, check your, grant award for the provisions. That's where we don't want to look at.
So other than the tag, the VPLs mentioned, the FOA itself, and then the grant award, that would be where all of the guidance would be located?
Correct. I rely primarily on the tag itself, but yeah, so you can look at the VPL as well as the FOA.
So here's a question about changing wages. And the question is, if you can change wages to improve the average wage, would they be changed on the participant tab?
Yes. I mean, you're talking about, I'm guessing it's a situation where somebody, let's say, had a job, lost the job, came back, and got another job, and it's better paying, for example?
I think that's what the question is, yeah.
Yeah, then you just, it's a continuation of the current enrollment. You're just reopening the case and then changing the outcome.
Okay. And if it was past that 90 days, there would be a new case opened, so you wouldn't need to change the wage. You would just report the new wage, correct? Correct.
Now, keep in mind, if you had somebody with success before, you're kind of taking a risk in terms of re-enrolling them. And that's just something to pay attention to.
Great, thank you. So there is a question about follow-up for option year 1 folks in their initial option year, but I think it would apply to option year folks as well, option year 2 folks as well. And that is, who has to do follow-up and who doesn't? And I know you mentioned this, but I think because the question came up, it's worth repeating. Which of the option year grantees have to do the follow-up and tracking and which do not?
Okay. Just consider everybody must do follow-up. I'll start with that. And we have one exception, and that is those grants who were new awards in PY16 that did not have follow-up requirements attached with it. They were given the option of reporting or not reporting follow-up in PY17. That is the only year that applies. In PY18, everybody collects follow-up. No exceptions.
Okay, so a PY16 grantee who did not ask for the additional 3% money and did not agree to do follow-up would be the only ones who would not be required to do that reporting.
That is correct.
Great. Had a couple of questions of that one, so I thought we might want to answer that just to make sure folks understood. Let's see. So there's a couple more questions, and I think we've talked about this, but it's about what happens when you have a participant, they're placed, perhaps they get they're exited, they get a new job later on, If they're not re-enrolled in the program, you wouldn't do anything, right?
That is correct.
And if they were re-enrolled in the program, what you do would depend on whether 90 days had passed or not.
That is correct.
Okay. So if 90 days have passed, it's a new enrollment, and if 90 days have not passed, it's a change to the existing enrollment.
Correct. And again, these changes to the existing one or re-enrolling them, they're decisions made by the grantee. So it's not automatic. You don't have to re-enroll somebody if you don't want to, or reopen a case. It's at your discretion, because it may not be appropriate to serve the individual or provide additional services in some instances, because it may be too large of a risk.
Great, thank you. Another question just about reporting. Anybody who has not received additional funding does not have to do additional follow-up reporting.
Well, that's not true necessarily. I mean, not everybody
Okay.
received additional funding. You were allowed to ask for up to 3% above your award. So if
no,
you're...
I'm sorry, let me fix that question, Brad. If
Okay.
they did not get re-awarded, either through an option year or a new award, they do not have to do any follow-up.
That is true. Yes, that's correct. I'm sorry. Misunderstood your question.
Yeah, I misspoke it, so I wanted to say it the right way, give the person who asked it the true meaning of what the question was. What documentation is required to verify retention?
It's not retention anymore. We're just looking for employment either in the second quarter or in the fourth quarter, right? So the documentation were on the screen I showed earlier, where we talked about pay stubs, printouts from employers. It could be tax returns if a self-employed, things like that. Pay stubs would probably be the most likely one you're getting from the participant.
Okay, great. Let's see. For grantees who requested additional funding for follow-up, how should that funding be tracked on the FFR and TPN? Or is there not a need to separate out costs related to follow-up?
No, there's no longer, you don't have to separate costs. The PY16 grant is pretty much closed out now, so there's no funding associated with that. You're not reporting on that. What you're doing now is using PY17 funds to collect and report outcomes in PY17 for those who had exited in PY16.
Okay. And again, for the folks who are doing their follow-up for PY16, they should be using the updated PY16 TPR for that follow-up, and then the most recent version of the PY17 TPR to track their new participants.
Correct.
Okay. So here's a question. First, there's a thank you, Brad, for holding this webinar. And then the second part of the question is, if we carry over participants from the prior year, are those individuals and their subsequent employment counted towards the plan goals?
Repeat that question. I'm not sure I quite understand.
If they carry over participants from the previous year, then they can count those as both new enrollments and placements in the current year.
That's correct.
Great. There's a couple of questions about the TPR with the blue starburst and where to get that. So I'm going to try and send the link out to everybody through the chat room to the VETS HVRP homepage in just a moment.
Right, and it's on the presentation as well.
And what documentation is required to show a vet was incarcerated?
Generally, there's either working with well, I mean, I'll have to look at the documentation for that, because I don't know offhand, but I'm just thinking out loud that there's probably some documentation from when when the individual was sentenced and incarcerated.
Okay, and that person can also follow up with their GOTR as well with specific questions?
Right. Yeah, and normally if they've been released, they might be being associated with a parole officer or probation officer. And, you know, they can provide evidence of incarceration.
So there's a question about allowable costs after placement. So if a veteran is placed and then placed in employment and then needs additional supportive services like maybe tools for the job that they've been placed in, are those allowable costs?
Supportive services would be, you're correct.
Okay. And again, for any questions like specifically around allowable costs, I usually say to folks, check in with your GOTR as well on that.
Correct.
So there's another point about clarification about when folks need a new ID, when a participant needs a new ID. And it's, the question is it after 90 days? And I think the answer is not any time after 90 days. It's if they have been exited and then it's been 90 days since they've exited and you're re-enrolling them, they need a new ID, correct?
Correct.
Okay. A couple of folks are mentioning that they've had challenges in the past with their TPR getting corrupted, and just wondering if you have any suggestions on what they might be able to do to prevent that from happening in the future and then having to kind of start all over.
I'm trying, trust me. I mean, there are protections in it, in the TPR itself. Sometimes when you download, and I'm not sure if it's just the browser we're using or what was going on, sometimes the file can be corrupted that way. I just have to take them one at a time, I guess, or kind of hit and miss in terms of the problems that seem to come up with how the TPR gets corrupted.
Okay, thanks. So it's not just one person's struggle, right? We all struggle with that technology piece sometimes.
We all do, yeah.
So there's a question about co-enrollment, and if co-enrollment hasn't occurred in the same, let's see, it says, if co-enrollment has not occurred, can we count the enrollment? Do we have time to get them co-enrolled beyond the quarter? So I think the question is, do co-enrollment and HVRP enrollment have to happen in the same quarter, or can you enroll someone in HVRP and then do the co-enrollment piece at a later quarter?
Yeah, there's no requirement to, there's no period of time when we say you must enroll somebody in an AJC at this point in time when you do HVRP. We're not specifying that at all. It's up to the grantee to determine when it's appropriate to co-enroll somebody in an AJC for those services. So it could be enrollment in the first quarter for HVRP, and it could be the third quarter when you put them into an AJC because you're going into placement services or something like that, looking for a job.
Okay, great. I think the confusion may have come because carryover participants who were co-enrolled in the previous year would have to be marked as being co-enrolled in that first quarter because they had already been enrolled. So perhaps that was what the confusion was there.
Okay.
There was a request from a couple of different advets to just clarify that for placement to count, it has to be a legal wage, i.e. something that's taxable. It can't be under the table sort of kind of employment. So just a clarification there from that. And then just a question. Go ahead, Brad.
No, I was just going to say with wages, I mean, it all goes to the documentation you have. I mean, if they can document that the person was employed and the employer gives you the information, even though for them it's under the table, so to speak, as long as you have the documentation, you're covered for a placement.
Okay. And then just a question on how the forms and the various versions will be updated on the website, and if folks will be notified when there are changes to those forms, so they'll know that they need to go get the latest version?
Yes, I'll work through you in terms of getting an email blast out when the forms have changed.
Great. Thank you. We have about 1 minute at our time, so I'm trying to get through the questions that we haven't touched yet. Just so everyone knows, if we have not, there's a few questions that we haven't gotten to. If we don't get to everything, we will make sure that we get those to Brad and that we get answers for folks so that everybody's questions get answered. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on NVTAC. It will also go out in a follow-up email probably tomorrow afternoon as well. So you'll be able to re-listen to it as well. So just to get that up there. Let's see. So there's a question about the TPN for PY17 that's on the HVRP site, that it's not a Word document, and that is correct. It's an Excel spreadsheet, correct?
The TPN is actually a fillable Adobe
it's an Adobe, okay.
Form. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's see. Just looking to see if there's anything else that was not covered in our. We're 1 minute over, Brad, and I don't want to go over too much of your time.
It's fine.
A couple of other sort of clarification points that anybody who has additional questions, we will get answers to, folks. But you can also reach out to your GODER, DVET, or AdVet, who monitors your grant, with any specific questions. That's what they're there to do, and they are more than willing to help you and get answers to those questions for you. There's one last question about that link, so I'm going to find that link and I will post it in the chat box. Any last words, Brad, before we close out here?
No, I mean, as you said earlier, if they have any questions about the TPR or experience problems, talk to their GODER. They're the primary person to contact in that regard.
Great. Well, Brad, I want to thank you so much for taking your time today. As I said, anybody whose questions we didn't get to, we will. I'll check in with Brad and we'll make sure we get answers to those questions. And this webinar will be posted 24 hours from now, so tomorrow afternoon. It will be available in the recorded form. Thank you again, Brad, and thanks to everyone for listening today.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.